My name is Chip Jones, and privileged to be here today and to facilitate this discussion. I'm an attorney with Littler Mendelson, a large labor and employment law firm, and focus a practice on whistleblower retaliation, corporate misconduct, executive misconduct cases. And we'll just go ahead and introduce him. We'll get to our imaginary friend here in a minute. That we know he's been posting on LinkedIn, so we know he's in the building. So hopefully he'll join us momentarily. But to my left is Jill Weimer, one of our rising stars at Littler. So Jill, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Jill. I'm a shareholder in the Pittsburgh office of Littler. I work with Chip in the Whistleblower Retaliation and Corporate Ethics group, as well as the HR Auditing group, are my two primary focuses. Thanks for having me.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mary Donson. I'm the Chief Compliance Leader for two of the biggest business groups at Nokia, Mobile Networks and Global Services, and I'm also the Compliance Leader for the North America region. Thanks for having me.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Michelle Brown. I am the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer at Leidos and also Deputy General Counsel. For those of you who aren't familiar with Leidos, we are a Fortune 500 information technology, engineering and science solutions and services business serving the defense and intelligence, homeland security, civil and health markets. And really delighted to be here.
Michelle, since you've got the mic, let's kind of
Sure.
talk about baseline in terms of your involvement with investigations and kind of how Leidos approaches investigations.
Okay, so as the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer, I oversee our whistleblower investigations program. So in that capacity, I manage our hotline and also our enterprise case management system that tracks and monitors investigations. From a reporting standpoint, I report not only to our CEO, but also the chair of our Ethics and Corporate Responsibility Committee. And in that capacity, report quarterly to our ethics board and then once annually to the full board, reporting on a wide range of issues, but from an investigative standpoint on our quarterly or annual case activity, any trends that we're seeing, significant case activity, also disciplinary action, and just any other noteworthy developments.
Mary, how about you?
Yeah, so at Nokia, within our ethics and compliance organization, we have a standalone investigations team that's dedicated full-time to investigating all the cases. And despite the fact, though, that I'm not involved, on the front lines with the fact-finding and actually conducting the investigations, I consider myself to be very, very involved day-to-day in the investigations because I partner very closely with the investigators. They support all investigations globally across all regions and all business groups, and I partner with them very, very closely to make sure I'm aware of any significant investigation that might impact one of the business groups I support or the regions I support. Hi, Antonio. And I'm, primarily looking at it from make sure my business leaders know what's happening, make sure we're identifying trends and I can report that to them, and then very, very important, make sure that whatever facts come out of this investigation, I am driving whatever steps we need to take to remediate. So it might be remediation, we need training, we need awareness, there's a gap somewhere that we have to develop a process to close, or perhaps we need discipline. And I'm responsible for ensuring that the remediation happens or the discipline goes forward. I'll convene the disciplinary committees and gather the stakeholders. So I feel that I partner very, very closely with investigations to make sure that we carry out everything we need to do to make our compliance program work.
And Antonio, we built up your entrance. That you were waiting to make a grand entrance, so don't let us down. Go ahead and introduce yourself and kind of go into the next question. It's kind of your role with investigations.
Sure. My name is Antonio Fernandez. I'm the Chief Compliance and Ethics Officer, Chief NERC Officer for PSEG. I've been in that role for about 2 years this month. Prior to that, I was in General Electric's headquarters compliance program, where along with some of the people in the audience, I was very fortunate to lead, be part of the leadership team that led the Ombuds program for GE, which is a little bit unique in what I've experienced across other companies, but it is their internal resource by which most internal investigations are managed or concerns are managed. Before that, I was in various utilities, and prior to that, I started my career as an honors programs lawyer in a federal agency. So a lot of my work has really been in compliance and concern management and investigations from the early stages of my career. And nowadays, as the Chief Compliance Officer, I am not the person really directing the investigations unless they're very, bet the company kind of issues. My role relative to the investigations program is that I'm the ultimate owner of the program, so I'm responsible for ensuring that all of the things that were just mentioned are actually really being accomplished, and that we are applying the limited resources that we have in the most effective way to be the most impactful for the company, whether that is allocating the resources or the people or training or corrective actions. So ultimately, as in probably most of your organizations, the Chief Compliance Officer is not technically the doer in a lot of those things, but it's really facilitating and making sure you're removing roadblocks and allowing your people to really be successful in what they're supposed to be doing.
And one of the things about conferences like this is to be able to share, what people do, how they do things. And even though my question has the word should in it, I don't take that to mean that should is implying that one is better than the other, because investigation methods are kind of like snowflakes. Everybody's a little bit differently. So let me start down at the end, Michelle, with you. Kind of what are some things that work well in terms of determining how to investigate, what investigators to choose, when to use outside counsel? What are some of the learnings that you've had over the years?
Sure. Just as a starting point, we have 8 different channels for reporting a concern at our company. And to kind of set the stage a little bit, just to give you a sense of how concerns come in, only 19% of our concerns last year, and we had close to 400, were reported through our independent hotline. 81% of the concerns actually touched a person at our company, which means that they were raised to a supervisor or to an HR line representative, as an example. And that compares to benchmark data where global benchmarking data is about 60% come in through a hotline. So that's kind of just to set the stage as a starting point. When a concern comes in, we triage it. And we have 12 different issue categories. And so depending upon the nature of the concern, we then assign an independent subject matter expert, typically from a particular function, who then will lead that investigation. So we let the nature of the concern drive the appropriate SME. So about 54% of our concerns, not surprisingly, are in the HR workplace relations realm. So as an example, if a concern comes in that, say, raises a harassment or inappropriate workplace behavior, we are going to assign that to a senior workplace relations investigator. On the other hand, if a concern comes in and let's say it's a workplace safety issue, then a senior investigator from our security department will handle that. Or as a government contractor, we take potential mischarging and misuse of resources very seriously. Those will be led by legal working hand in hand with internal audit. So we don't have a one-size-fits-all approach, and we think that preserves the requisite level of independence and objectivity. And these are all individuals outside of the business organization, which we think is really critical. We promote quality control and consistency, and it's a very collaborative approach, working hand in hand, again, with the investigators across the functions. We have biweekly meetings tracking all open investigations in the company. So to the extent that there are any significant developments in those 2 weeks, we will discuss those. But again, it ensures a consistency of discussion among the investigators as well. And we look at things, and at the end of an investigation, the investigator will brief the investigation. We all have to come to an agreement on whether the investigation is complete. Does it require any further action? We have to come to an agreement on the attributed root cause, underlying where misconduct was found to have occurred, or if there are any contributing factor or factors, what those are, and also discussing appropriate remedial action. And With respect to outside counsel, we really don't engage outside counsel all that often for purposes of these investigations, and I think that's attributable to several factors. One of which is these biweekly meetings that I talked about are attended by senior members of our legal team. Also, as Deputy General Counsel, I oversee the legal investigations in the company, and not just our regulatory compliance, but other members, particularly in the labor, employment, and government contracts areas. And so it really is, involves only those matters that pose significant reputational or legal risk to the company, where we really need to engage outside counsel and just in general very senior members of our legal department that typically can handle the matters in-house.
And I'd like to drop a footnote on that quality control concept. We'll come back to that because there's some important points there. Mary, what about Nokia?
Yeah, well, a lot of this is similar, and I see some differences too. I think we have a very similar approach to when we engage outside counsel, and it certainly gets to risk factor and exposure to the company. One difference I see is we actually have, rather than certain subject matter experts for each type of case, we have a large dedicated team of investigators that are part of the Ethics and Compliance organization, and they will investigate cases across all regions and across all business groups. We have a number of avenues that people can report concerns when they come in, and those are used to varying degrees, but I like that it comes in. What has worked well for us is that the investigations group is that central intake point. So I think you have a good handle on your data, you have control over the data, you see everything that's coming in. We certainly funnel out the HR cases and health and safety, but we retain all the true ethics and compliance matter, and the investigators will investigate them and then partner with the compliance leaders to take the necessary steps. I think what works well for us, again, is having that initial intake. You control the data, you see what's coming in, you see the trends, you see how much is going where. And for us, I think it's allowed us to develop a very consistent approach to investigating cases, so that each investigator, no matter where they are in the globe, no matter what area they're looking into, it's the same protocol, even from the report to their KPIs and trying to open the matter, make sure they close it. How are they reading it out to the business? How are they interacting with the compliance leaders? There's a lot of consistency, and I also think within the company, the employees, I think it helps drive the sense that they're impartial, that they're fair, that they're not sitting in a particular place and maybe care more or trust more this area than that. They just investigate. So for us, it's just helped drive the sense that this is a fair process and you will be heard, and this is what these people do full time, and the only thing they care about is understanding the facts and getting to the bottom of it.
So, Jill, quick question. A lot of times as outside counsel, we're put in the position of having to defend your investigations. Either they've gone bad or just still having to defend them. So kind of what have you learned in terms of when an issue comes in, you're triaging it, what advice in terms of what to think about when things could go bad?
Sure. And I don't know if anybody in the room will be surprised to hear this, but I think consistency is the absolute most important thing. Being able to show that how you handle this particular investigation is perhaps what you've done in the past, and that there's no sort of inconsistency as it relates to one type of complaint over another. I think the second biggest thing is making sure that the folks who are doing the investigations, and it's wonderful if you work in a corporate environment where you have a dedicated team of investigators. I think the reality is a lot of companies are using or relying on their HR department for these types of functions. And being a really good HR generalist or HR manager does not make you a really good investigator. And a lot of times we watch our clients sort of, well, this is your area, you're in the employment and human resources realm, go and do this investigation. And I wish it were that simple, but it's not. And really worst case scenario in this type of situation is when you have an inadequate investigation or an incomplete investigation, and you're not doing that after the fact follow-up, tying it up with a bow. Because in that scenario, it's almost worse off than you hadn't done the investigation to begin with.
Antonio, anything to offer, or you want to move on to kind of...
No, the only thing I'll say is we involve outside counsel when we are thinking way down the road, and what is that person that may be adverse to us going to say if we staff the investigation with an internal resource. So usually if we have matters involving officers of the company or the board, or where you might think, this might end up in a shareholder lawsuit, for example. So you want to protect management and the board such that there's no question as to the independence of the investigation. So that's usually our litmus test for when we involve outside counsel. Like most other companies here, probably you've gone through the process of insourcing a lot of your outside legal work. So you have very talented legal professionals that work inside the company that can do a lot of the investigations that are required to be privileged. So when you're deciding to go outside, it's more of a risk assessment as to, when you're being second guessed on, is this truly independent, that you can really answer that question the right way. Yeah,
that's a great point too. When it comes in terms of defending the investigation, is thinking about what is this person going to look like in front of a jury, in front of a regulator, in front of a client. So you need to make those kind of calls early on as well. Kind of next topic. So, Antonio, let's start with you in terms of doing anything unique or different to ensure that employees kind of respect the investigation function.
Yeah. So, not unlike some of the other people on the panel, we do have a lot of people that come to us through that outside hotline, helpline reporting channel. And like I said at the beginning, I started in my role about 2 years ago. And one thing that I noticed was in our internal communications, explaining what the compliance program was about and explain to employees that they had an obligation to speak up, that we wanted them to speak up, there was going to be no retaliation. We very prominently marketed the helpline as the first thing in that communication when we listed our list of resources. And it had and I don't know if you've heard about like food menus at restaurants. The thing that they want you to order the most, they usually put on the very top. So it's the same thing as with posters about speaking up. So we were seeing people really using the outside helpline a lot. To us, we like that people are coming to us at all, but going to the outside helpline is very close to going to a newspaper reporter or going to a government agency. It's really close to not allowing you to really chart the course of how that concern is going to be managed. So our team very carefully rethought how we were going to present the options, and we still present the helpline, but we've moved it to the bottom of the list. And the person at the top of the list is the manager, right? The manager is the person that's the closest to the employee, that usually has the best ability to influence the outcome of a concern that's being raised. And what we did is, as we raised the prominence of the manager as the first line of defense, we then also, in turn, gave all the managers in the company in-person training on what are you supposed to do when that person comes to you on Friday afternoon when you have a million things going on and says, here's this big problem. So, because most managers, we found, are not very well equipped for that situation. They're very well equipped to deal with the day-to-day issues that are within the scope of their job, but when this person that usually doesn't have a great working relationship with the manager comes to their office with this big problem at an inconvenient time, we found that managers were failing over and over again to do the right thing. They weren't calling the right resources. They were, as we call, self-medicating. They're like, oh, it's a harassment issue. I know how to do this. Well, how do you know how to do this? You're a mechanical engineer that works on valves, right? So it was educating people to be able to do that. And that really has driven a lot of change in our speak-up culture. We've gotten a lot of positive feedback, not only from the concern raisers, but also from the managers that now feel a little bit more supported by the compliance team, and that now they feel that they understand, here's generally what I'm supposed to do, and now I know who I'm supposed to call when I feel like I'm in a pickle.
What about Mary? What about Nokia? And in particular for Michelle as well, is kind of talking about when organizations evolve and managing that culture change.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest changes that we've introduced to help drive the speak-up culture and enlighten people about the investigations process is to roll out a global ombuds program. And we just started that last year, and we're continuing the rollout this year. So we took a look around and we said, hey, we've got a ton of avenues for people to report. We've got the helpline. We've got all kinds of formal, you can go online and you can make phone calls and certainly go to anyone in legal. And you can certainly go to your line manager, and we encourage people to do that. But when we looked at some of our surveys and saw what is the comfort level and how much do people really trust that there will be no retaliation and we really want to hear from them, while the numbers were good, they weren't terrible, we wanted them to be even better. And so we said, what else can we do? And what we liked about this Global Ombuds program is we are rolling it out to as many sites as we possibly can across the world. And it's people specifically, they're not in HR, they're not in legal, they're not your line manager. They're people that are well respected, trusted, have a lot of good common sense and the right attributes. We interview them, we give them training. Are they trustworthy? Are they calm? Are they approachable? And these are people co-located with you in the same time zone, speak the same language. So if you sort of have a question, you're wondering, should I raise this? Is this a big deal? Rather than going through some sort of, remote process, you can actually just walk down the hall, go in, and talk to the ombuds. And the ombuds are really charged. They have two main missions. One is to drive that speak up culture, so make people understand the importance of speaking up when they have concerns. Mm-hmm. And two is really facilitating reporting. So for a lot of people, despite all our best efforts, it might be a little mystifying. How do I report? And after I report, why didn't I hear anything? Does that mean nothing's happening? And they're there to sort of demystify it, explain it, put a human face, be a point of contact. So we're still in the process of rolling out, but we're already getting returns. People are already going to their local ombuds leaders, and that's how we're getting concerns initiated. And so that's been a very positive development for us.
And Michelle, to tweak the question just a little bit in terms of kind of the biggest challenge that you face in addressing the speak up culture, because it's really easy to put a poster out there, but it's much more difficult to have the manager, as Antonio mentioned, be able to intake and kind of process an issue. So kind of lead us off. What are some of the biggest challenges that you see?
Well, we experienced a very significant challenge about a year and a half ago. In August of 2016, our company merged with Lockheed Martin's information systems and global solutions business. So basically overnight, our company doubled in size to 32,000 employees. Now granted, we had a multi-month, pre-merger integration process, but nevertheless, onboarding, about 16,000 employees, was quite significant. And, quite candidly, we assumed, okay, you're increasing, the employee population by that level. We're going to see a double, or close to it, a doubling of investigative activity, and that just didn't happen. And what we found was there was an actual underreporting of concerns on the legacy Lockheed side. And in digging a little bit deeper, doing some research, we found that maybe we shouldn't have, expected that in times of stress, like a merger, despite employees witnessing or observing potential misconduct by about 21.5%, they actually don't report the concerns. They don't think that it's a good time to stick their necks out, and they just want to keep their heads down and do their work. And so we needed to address that. And so we engaged in a very active communication campaign, notifying our employees about the avenues to report a concern, our investigative protocol, and our absolute zero tolerance for retaliation policy. We implemented it was an initiative to this day that it's still one of the things I'm most proud of. It was a video and a campaign that everyone is an ethics officer at Leidos. And we sent out this campaign. It was fresh. It was, under 2 minutes, loud music, got people's attention, and it's a great video. And essentially, it brands our employees that regardless of the role that they came in to fill, that they are dual-hatted. That if you're an engineer or an auditor, notwithstanding that, you are also an ethics officer at our company. And that's a responsibility that doesn't just rest with me or members of my team. And since then, every week at our new employee orientation, along with our CEO, we show that video to our new employees. And we again, it goes to the culture and indoctrination, essentially, on day one at our company, and what that obligation means, which is consistent with the language in our code. That it's not that we have an expectation, a requirement actually, that if you believe that possible misconduct has occurred, you have an obligation, you are required as an employee at our company to report it. And then additionally, sent out a year in review email to all employees, a very detailed email providing our case activity for the year, reminding employees about the reporting channels. Essentially, I'm a big believer in transparency to promote trust, and that in doing so, again, reminding employees of the non-retaliation policy. And we, over time, you talked about some of the changes to your posters and things. We revamped ours. We sent out hotline cards to all 32,000 employees, including those in international locations, with reminders of their obligations on the cards. Revamped our posters, our internal ethics hub to make internal resources more readily available. And last was we learned that at Lockheed it wasn't uncommon for these kind of preliminary investigations to take place, at the local level, either by the manager or by the HR business partner. And so, to the extent that they determined that, there's no merit, this shouldn't be substantiated, it never got escalated. And so we partnered with the HR leadership team to educate them and ultimately managers in the organization of the reporting channels and to essentially escalate any concerns, up to our office or one of the other reporting channels. So by Q2 of last year, we saw an uptick in reporting and actually an even distribution of reported concerns across the legacy company and Leidos, and that has remained consistent through today. So it took some time and quite a concerted and proactive effort to get there, but we've gotten there.
All right, a quick raise of hand. How many have used an ombuds program at all? So kind of the minority, which I expected, but we've got a lot of experience with those programs. So Antonio, kind of walk us through what you see the kind of the merits of having an ombuds program, and particularly how it relates to investigations.
So everything I know about ombuds I learned at GE. So full disclosure, it's no original ideas here. So I see the ombuds program as a great channel if you do it correctly. So selecting the right people, making sure that they are respected by the workforce, making sure that they're not aligned to the functions that you would ordinarily expect to manage concerns like HR and legal. So people that are actually within the lines of business that have impeccable judgment. So in some of the businesses at GE, and Charlene Giuson is the global ombuds leader for GE, so if you have questions about GE's program, she's here, she can answer them. But like at one of GE's businesses, the aviation business, it was a rite of passage. So their chief compliance officer said, talk to the president of that business and said, how about we make this where you take your hypos to develop this skill of problem solving and analyzing and really having good sound judgment in really difficult situations. And that's what they do. When people are getting ready to make that big jump between a senior professional and executive at GE and in the aviation business, they are charged with these kinds of ombuds roles, and they're seen as a good thing, as a recognition that the company's investing in you, has recognized that you have sound judgment, that you are able to think strategically but act tactically. And if you do it correctly, and if you select the right people, it can create so many dividends as it relates to creating a speak-up culture. Because now you have a person that's located right there, and for those of you that operate globally, the thing that you always are worried about is, how do I translate the values and the strategy from, Boston, Massachusetts to Jakarta, Indonesia, and trust that person in Jakarta that I've now empowered to make decisions for the company is making decisions that are aligned to our values, to what's important to us, and they're driving the right culture. And the ombuds program is a key, it's like a secret sauce, if you will. If you go and you visit a GE site and you say, where's your ombuds? Almost everybody will know where the ombuds sit. They'll know who they are, and the ombuds will know almost all of the people at their site. So these people really drive, they're really change culture, they're really culture agents. And the fact that they are not sitting within legal or compliance or HR, it's also even more important because it reinforces the thought that this stuff, ethics and compliance, is important not just to the functions but to the business. And this person already, remember who I told, these are the hypos that are important, that people know this person's going places. So it just has tons of dividends, but you have to do it right. You've got to pick the right person. It's very, and probably that's one of the most difficult things. Because once you get the right person, you train them, you educate them. If you have a program that they can plug in, that's great. But you can't have half measures on this kind of stuff. Because you put the wrong person in that job and you hold them out as, you know, the role model for this kind of stuff, that could be very problematic. So it's not without a need for constant care and attention and the dedication of resources.
Mary, kind of stole a little bit of your international thunder there, but kind of internationally, what do you see as the big challenges?
Well, it's interesting because I think it relates to the Ombuds program and dovetails with it, because I think a point Antonio was alluding to, that you might have this global policy and it's fine, all well and good to say we support the speak up culture and we want you to report concerns, but what that means when you get very locally, you know, even from region to various sites in a region really varies. So to have those ombuds leaders there, I think the key challenge is you really need to go local. You need to connect with people locally so they understand, they have an avenue that makes them comfortable and feel supported in raising concerns and speaking up. So the ombuds help us do that. And I see, even let's just take North America, from site to site, the methods the ombuds people want to use to help drive the speak up culture really varies. So, you know, at one site, people love the Coffee and Connects, or they want to have line manager training, you know, with their ombuds. In another site, they want a big town hall, they want everyone there, and that's how they want to learn more. So that's why it's so good to basically leverage your resources, the people you can trust in those sites, to figure out, we've got this global policy, what's the best way to translate this locally?
And Jill, Antonio mentioned kind of the worst case scenario when you've got a bad person inserted into this process. Kind of what, you know, when you're faced with that situation, what's some of the advice you give to companies?
Sure. So, you know, I think when we were talking and preparing for the panel, the three things that I've seen happen the most often that I, you know, given the opportunity to approach litigation avoidance with my clients and talk about, like, okay, what did we do really well here and what can we improve upon for next time? I think the first issue is having a policy and procedure that's written down, that people know where it is, and, you know, it works for you as opposed to against you. I've dealt with a lot of hesitation from clients about committing the internal investigation process to writing, you know, in various forms, because then they feel sort of tied down to a particular approach. But it really can help in terms of going back to consistency, but also it's the hope that it becomes my Exhibit A as your outside counsel, and something that I can really point to in support and defense of, you know, the efforts the company has gone to make sure that we are doing the right things, that we are investigating, that we are, you know, aiming for compliance. The second thing I think I find most interesting, and this was born out of a conversation that I had with a plaintiff's employment lawyer, and you know, I normally don't associate myself with such folks, but a friend from law school, special exception. But in any event, I said to him, you know, so tell me about, this is an area that's a very active area for him in his practice, and I said, what's bringing people to your door? Why are people calling you? And making these reports and complaints, and what's driven them there. And he said that it's because they've made an internal complaint and it went to somebody, whether it was their first level manager, who took the approach of, I can handle this on my own, I want to take responsibility for it. It's not always a nefarious reason, but, you know, this is my job, I'm the manager, I'm supposed to be able to handle this. Or, you know, some other report internally that from an internal perspective, they may have launched a massive investigation. They might be pulling, you know, ESI and spending a ton of money, but if they're not circling back with the complaining employee and letting them know, at a minimum, hey, we're still working on this, we appreciate your patience, we're doing the best job to make sure we're being thorough. If you're not having those follow-up conversations, it goes back to what Mary was saying, you know, you fall into a scenario where the employee feels like they're in the dark and they really don't have any other choice but then to go and call plaintiff's employment lawyer. And I think the final thing is that the willingness of a client to sort of let the investigation, I think Michelle mentioned this, let the investigation lead itself without, natural inclination to try to keep everything in a box and contain it and cut down on gossip and make sure it doesn't become a bigger deal or issue than it needs to be. But in doing so, making sure that you're also following up on leads, speaking to all of the witnesses involved, even if it's a department or an area or a manager that you didn't think was implicated in the particular complaint or concern, still go and talk to those folks, because if you're not following, some may consider them rabbit holes, but you really never know where a lead's going to take you. So I think sometimes clients have an interest in keeping a very sort of contained scope to the best of our ability, but also when, as an outside counsel, I come to you and say, I really think that we need to get these other folks involved or do these additional interviews, a willingness to kind of allow that to happen so that we make sure that we're doing the best job possible in terms of completeness of the investigation.
And one of the things that we're seeing kind of across the board right now is kind of related to the Me Too movement and making sure that all issues are being channeled to the right people. So, Michelle, you talked about having 8 different methods, intake channels. So what are you doing to make sure that everything is getting into one of those 8 channels, and then making sure that, for example, the board is being made aware of all issues that obviously can't tell them everything, but we're seeing cases where executive misconduct cases are being settled, and then that data is never being reported to the board. So kind of what are you doing to make sure that the right information is getting to the stakeholders?
Yeah. And just with respect to the Me Too movement, as a federal government contractor, unlike some other industries, this wasn't really an issue that we just all of a sudden kind of woke up, late this summer or fall about. It's an issue that within our industry and within our company, we have been actively addressing for some time now. So we first wanted to assure ourselves as a management team that we were appropriately handling harassment cases, both sexual and non-sexual, and that there was a consistency in approach and in those matters. So we partnered with HR and did essentially a year look back, 4 quarters, to look at those cases, do a deep dive within them, again, to assure ourselves that they were being handled appropriately. And then, briefed our leadership team, and then ultimately our board's ethics and corporate responsibility committee early last December at our Q3 board meeting. And I think that we will, in terms of do a great deal in terms of promoting, as I mentioned, communications, everywhere you turn, again, whether it's a hotline poster or what have you, or repeated communications, advising our employees of the different avenues of reporting. I think that, there's always a concern, is there an underreporting, especially in this area? And so we've done some things even since then to kind of shake the trees, if you will, to the extent that wasn't happening in issues. Employees, just again, for fear of retaliation, typically is the primary reason why they don't report. But in terms of what we ultimately reported and found, I noted that, some of these cases presented challenges, and I'm sure many of you have similar situations where the subject of harassment concerns are not your employees, that they can involve your subcontractors, or even in certain instances, your customers, in our case, government customers. And so that in and of itself presents certain challenges. But what we noted was that in terms of limitations on our abilities to investigate, we have a far greater ability to direct removal based upon the terms of our subcontracts, to require removal of subcontract employees, but often, other than requesting that the government initiate its own investigations, if we've got the subject of an investigation as a government employee, we can make certain accommodations and offerings to our employee, recommending or requesting or offering that they be transferred to another program. But we did note in every case over the past 4 quarters, even those that were unsubstantiated, that some level of remedial action was taken in every instance. And that might be some additional guidance, training, some type of remedial action taken every single time. And then we also reviewed and briefed to our leadership team and then to the board committee as well, took a deep dive looking at our the adequacy of our harassment policy, our trainings. And also, our follow-up process with referring sources. So again, feeling that all things said and done, we were very comfortable with that approach. But subsequent to that, our CEO did send an email out to all employees, notifying them of the seriousness with which we as a company approach this, reminding them of the avenues, and again, absolute zero tolerance for retaliation. And then soon thereafter in January, at our annual leadership summit with the top 250 in the company, we had a dedicated outside speaker come and speak on sexual harassment to the leaders, and then it also comprised a part of my presentation as well.
Antonio, has this changed any of your approaches on what you report up to the stakeholders?
No, but what I'd say is, me too, it's just further reminder of that thing that I think we all worry about, that we'll forget to follow up on a concern. So it's a reminder that you have to follow up on everything. And because of the complexity of the world that we live in, social media, how quickly news travels from internal to external, it puts a finer point, and it's a further reminder that what we do is changing every day. So these issues, and investigating them and how to manage the concern raiser and the subject of the allegation, it's still the same. I mean, that part of it has not changed as it relates to sexual harassment claims. What I think has changed is that the timing, the thoroughness of the review, how much external scrutiny what you do is going to be subjected to has completely changed. Now you have, the world spectating your internal investigations. So it just means you need to play at a higher level, and it means that you always have to ensure you're following up. For us, what we saw, and again, I've been in this role for 2 years, was we were seeing, remember I said self-medicating at the beginning, so we would have, really the example that I shared with you was a real example, an engineering manager that he thought how to manage an EEO concern related to harassment, and did a very bad job at it. And you're all laughing because you've all had it, right? It's a common story. But what we realized and management was very firm on was that we needed to change how that manager was going to be treated for having not managed the concern very thoughtfully. So, and I use this word very intentional, we wanted to make it very painful for you to not manage a concern like that type in the right way. And now, managers know that if they fail to report a harassment concern, that they will be terminated. And it's something that they understand, that it's very clear to them, and it's changed behaviors. Because once you tell somebody, your job, zero tolerance for you not reporting this, they're going to report it. And now we see managers changing how they behave. That's important.
Yeah. Mary, anything to add on this?
Yeah, just echoing some of that, I think to Antonio's point, we viewed this a little bit as it didn't change the way we report out or how we investigate, but we viewed it as somewhat as an opportunity, one, to increase employee confidence in the systems and the investigative process, to say, hey, we know this issue is out there, it's getting a lot of attention, we want to remind you we have these policies, we're here, speak up if you have a concern, an opportunity for us to refresh some of our communications around that. We know there's a lot of sensitivity, but I think it almost gives us a little more exposure. We're here, we're a resource. If this comes up, you need to come to us. So in some ways, it's an opportunity.
All right, I'm going to skip ahead to a question because I want to make sure we get back to that footnote I promised earlier. So, getting real-time data about your activities is always, kind of the best case scenario. So learning about something that went wrong in an investigation a year later is kind of too late, or learning about it when the lawsuit shows up on Jill's desk, there's not much you can do about it at that point. So what kind of, Michelle, I'd like to start off with you. Kind of what are you guys doing to make sure that you're getting real-time feedback about how the investigation function is working?
Sure. And I know that there are certain, some companies will engage employees or managers in surveys following the investigation. We do not. I mentioned the biweekly investigative review that's attended cross-functionally. We call it it's DQAT, the Defense Quality Assurance Team, and how it's structured, and to ensure really that nothing falls through the cracks and that each investigation is managed appropriately from beginning until end. And by that's ensuring that it's been triaged appropriately, that the appropriate functional SME is leading that investigation, or perhaps, as we all know, sometimes it evolves into additional concerns that might require additional SMEs to become part of that investigation. And so with those updates and briefings, we have an opportunity to ensure that happens. And it really does promote consistency in our approach overall. And that's, determining when a case is substantiated or not, or as I mentioned, having to reach an agreement based upon the investigator's recommendation. And there are times when we disagree, and my team's here, and, again, but by talking through it, we really do ultimately, and again, with the other functional leads, arrive at the right determination and results, and that a case is not closed until, if there is remedial action, until the very last remedial measure has been taken. And so we think that process really promotes, and again, as I mentioned from the outset, we structure our investigations to ensure objectivity and independence, and that nothing is investigated by someone within the business. And then additionally, we have quarterly after action reviews. So all of the investigators in the company attend. We lead these meetings, but really covering a range of topics. And there might be a particular deep dive in a really interesting or novel case study or two. We talk about best practices to the extent that there have been any trends that we've noticed, or regulatory or legal developments. It's a wonderful opportunity to come together on a quarterly basis to discuss that. We do an annual ethics cultural survey that does, generally ask about, the handling of investigations. Obviously, the response that we get, is typically just a small subset. Only about, 1% of the employees, raise concerns in the company. But we look very closely at that as well. So we think that those mechanisms and those measures provide greater objectivity than soliciting feedback from the subject, or even at times a manager who might in some way be implicated as a result of that investigation. And by that, let's say it's a time charging review, and an employee is found to have engaged in misconduct, but perhaps because of inadequate supervision by the manager, the duration of the mischarging, it was a longer length than it should have been. So we think that overall that promotes a greater kind of quality assurance, if you will, than going back directly to the employee.
Antonio, Mary, anything you'd like to add on this topic?
So on this one, all I'll say is we recently introduced an investigator's code of conduct. So we were getting the similar feedback that people felt that the investigations were very prosecutorial, that the investigators were very aggressive. And we record some of our investigations, interviews, so I've listened back, and I can tell how somebody would get uncomfortable if they're being asked a very pointed question. But I don't think the investigators should stop doing that. So what we did to address that feedback was empower the people that experienced the interactions with the investigators with, if you go to hospitals in the United States nowadays, or a doctor's office, you always see a patient's bill of rights. So we modeled it after that, and it's something that's very publicized. And there was a perception that investigators did not answer to anybody, that they were this above the law group of people. We have a dedicated group of investigators. So when you participate in these things multiple times, you may have interacted with the same person. And it's been very well received. I think employees now feel oh, I can hold you against something. I now know what I can expect of you. And employees have been pushing back, and they said, you said that you're supposed to be doing this. I did not feel that. And we've sort of empowered them to know that they also have rights in that process.
We've got about 5 minutes left, so why don't we kind of do last thoughts, and Mary, why don't you kind of kick off any burning advice you'd want to give the audience on kind of how culture intersects with investigations?
Well, I know I spent a lot of time today talking about the Ombuds program, but I guess I would be a big proponent of that and highly recommend it, because even this last point we're talking about, when we get feedback, people's thoughts about the investigative process, or, hey, I never heard back, I don't think it's working. The Ombuds people are there to help answer these questions, demystify the process, assure them, yes, it's working, and simply because you're not hearing something doesn't mean it's not happening. They're helping to drive the speak-up culture and facilitate the reporting, and they're bringing it very, very local. So I think that's a really great way to help support your overall investigations process.
Michelle, you got any final thoughts you want to get out there?
You talked about demystifying the process, and I just think that is so critically important. I think any and every opportunity to promote transparency, to build trust, because at the end of the day, that's going to get the employees to engage and also to report when necessary. And so every opportunity, again, whether it's internal postings, we implemented last year, it was called Let's Talk Ethics, and it's juicy, right? It's employees love to hear about what's going on in the company, and employees who've engaged in misconduct, scrubbing so it's anonymous. It's like, get out the popcorn. And it's our highest readership. It is. But it's a wonderful opportunity to reinforce policy and procedures, let employees know how seriously we take this as a company, and and not every story results in termination. And so it's also an opportunity to highlight those instances, to educate, and where through various remedial measures, employees in the long run, hopefully, will benefit from the experience. So, culture at the end of the day, I think we'd all agree, I think is so critically important to really promoting strong and robust investigative processes. So anything, again, to promote transparency, I think is really key to that.
Jill, what about you? Any final advice for the group?
I think the last point I'd like to make in terms of after the investigation follow-up or surveys that some clients, there's a lot of discussion about that. And, Michelle's point about consistency is well taken, and I'll take that one step further by saying, if you do decide to implement something like that within your company or culture, make sure you're doing it and whatever worked product you're creating as a result of it, is your Exhibit A, just to use that example again, versus the other side. What I've seen in some scenarios where those follow-up surveys are conducted, it becomes sort of a automatic form that's generated that goes to somebody's inbox, and it's never looked at, and it's really never utilized, and then it just becomes this treasure trove of information for I know I'm the Grim Reaper defense counsel, but the, plaintiffs' lawyers want to get a hold of that bucket of information, particularly if there's not somebody internally that's really managing it and making sure, to the extent you find areas of improvement or inconsistency, that you're following up on them.
And just one example that I've seen recently of a client that I think this is a brilliant idea, and again, to I think Antonio's point, steal it shamelessly, is they've baked it into their continuous improvement philosophy. So the business had this continuous improvement focus for a long time, but ethics compliance had always kind of been outside of it. And so instead of it painting someone as a rebel for raising a concern, it's just now it's considered a suggestion to help improve the business, and you treat it in that fashion in a continuous improvement cycle. So it's still a little early to see how it works, but I think it's a great idea to try. So we got a few minutes, so any questions for anybody? Yes, sir.
What are you doing to develop yourselves to handle the close calls in the harassment category? I'm talking about where you suspect maybe it is misreporting. And I'm talking about where maybe the reasonable person wouldn't think of that as harassment. In the different cultures, the way they interpret that. And what are you doing to develop yourself so you can handle that problem optimally?
So as I mentioned, based upon, if a harassment case would come in, that would be led by one of our, experienced senior workplace relations leads, who again, highly trained. That's why we, as I mentioned, we don't have a one-size-fits-all approach. And, but to the extent there's that close call, and as I think many of us know, there's often that very fine line on sexual harassment cases. Is it sexual harassment, or is it really harassment, or is it just inappropriate workplace behavior? So that I would say is a starting point, and again, through these, biweekly DQuats, that's an opportunity to, frankly, with a lot of different perspectives and skill sets, to reach a conclusion as to whether it does rise to the level or not of harassment. And so kind of bringing in those collective heads from legal, HR, ethics, et cetera, I think helps arrive at probably as good of a determination as you can get.
And what we're seeing from our client standpoint is it's more about what is the C-suite doing to prepare for this question, because a lot of them just have operated in the same way for 20 years, and now all of a sudden they're expected to operate differently. Mm-hmm. And so we're seeing a lot of questions coming from the C-suite about, am I doing this right? They're really worried about, something coming to the forefront.
Mm-hmm. And I was going to add to that, I think it's very important just to be aware. You read the newspaper, you see what's happening. You've got to be very aware and make sure when you're getting any hint of anything that needs to be looked into, you're taking it very seriously. And probably everyone in this room already understands that. And our jobs are more making sure everyone else understands it. Like, look what's happening. We can't hesitate. We have to take these very seriously. If they're raised, we have to look into it and make a factual determination. Mm-hmm. Was there wrongdoing? Was there misconduct? There's no sitting on it. There's no brushing it off. There's no like, oh, it was just, this one little incident. You can't do that. And you have to make sure everyone understands that. Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the biggest issues.
Got another question back there.
Yes, one of the frustrations that we have is when an anonymous reporter doesn't give enough information to really investigate. So then the person making the report may feel that nothing got done. It's hard to do follow-up. You get a report, so-and-so's stealing, but no indication what they're stealing, what time, So how do you handle those anonymous reports where there's not enough meat to latch onto, and how do you deal with it?
So for us, the tool that we use allows us to communicate with the anonymous reporter. So we have that. So for us,
we have that.
So for us, it varies. Some people do and some people don't. So it's making something like that available and making sure it's easy to use. For the people that don't, and I think this goes back to how you market your program, you have to emphasize when you say you can report anonymously, you have to always add what follows to that statement. But if you do, this is what we found. And you've now met your obligation. I don't know that there's anything else that you can do. You've told them they can do it, but you've told them that if they do it and they don't give you enough information that you can't do anything about it, and you've given them a tool for them. Beyond that, I think, I don't know that I have any more insights.
The one thing that we recommend to our clients in those scenarios is using the opportunity the next time you have the department together or the managers as a group, taking 10, 15 minutes at the front or back end of those meetings just to say, we wanted to bring, remind everybody of their obligations. Here's our code of conduct. Here's a particular area where we just like to highlight and have a discussion and bring it to light. And at least then you can say, again, in the place where you're having to defend yourself, if it comes to that, here's the information we were given. Here's all we could do with that information based on scant details, but we took this extra step to remind everybody of our policies and procedures at that next opportunity.
Got another question back here. Yes, ma'am.
So one of the interesting, we all have a policy that says no retaliation. We all, I'm sure.
It's hard to hear you, I'm sorry.
We all have the policy that says no retaliation. I'm sure before we sit down with a subject or any witnesses, we go through that there's no retaliation.
Right.
We all try to keep investigations as confidential as possible to limit the possibility of retaliation. How do we actually, and yet, time and time again, the number one reason I think, Sean, you were saying that employees don't report is fear of retaliation. How do we effectively communicate that? I mean, there's a double-edged sword of whether you go back to people 3 months later or 6 months later. Retaliation's a hard thing to prove. I mean, hard retaliation, that's easy, but when are we ever doing something easy? What are your recommendations on how to really convince employees that there's no retaliation?
In advance of that question is hopefully you're doing a robust employee engagement survey, and you'll be amazed at how many times when that bad manager is identified in those employee engagement, that most likely that's going to be the source of someone that's going to retaliate, and so taking action in advance is a good practice to help get in front of that. But any other ideas too?
If us, the compliance people, are the ones that are talking about retaliation, then it doesn't matter, right? In my experience, the people who are most convincing about a non-retaliation message are your business leaders. So if the general counsel or the compliance officer or the ombudsperson is the tip of the spear on we do not retaliate, it's your job. It's sort of you're parroting the program's values. If the CEO of the company, if the president of the business unit, if the people below them talk about that in a meaningful way and act that way when they receive concerns, that's how you really move the needle on retaliation. And in the organizations where I've seen the worst, like chilled work environments, are where you have no retaliation posters everywhere and communications from the chief compliance officer, but if you go and do a survey, they tell you, oh, you have like hotspots of people that I know that so-and-so was retaliated against. So when you have that mismatch between what the functions are saying, what the business is doing, that's probably the worst situation. And the places where it works best is when the business actually is the one that's messaging and actually role modeling those behaviors.
Well, I think we're out of time, so we'll be glad to answer questions out in the hallway. But thanks for coming. Thank you to the panelists.
Thank you.